What a great pleasure it is to be here with you this morning. I come from the west coast of the United States in California, where I've lived the last 25 years. We are but a small group of people, a small group compared to the riches that you enjoy in this area. You can fill a room as big as this time after time, Sunday after Sunday, and that is a fantastic blessing, and I'm very excited to be able to share in that blessing with you this morning and happily point out to you, please don't forget what riches you are able to enjoy in this area. It's a wonderful thing. God has blessed you well. This morning, we're going to think about Hagar, very much under the title, I Am Seen, Hagar's story. The theme, therefore, is the one who is unseen. The theme is the one who is the outsider, the one who feels unincluded, if not actually excluded, at least not included, perhaps unvalued or undervalued. There's a tremendous irony associated with the theme of the outsider, because by definition, the outsider must be a very small majority. In terms of the number of people in this room, perhaps one, perhaps two, perhaps three of you could be outsiders. By definition, you have to have a core group from which you feel outside. So allowing that we could only have 1% or 2% that could ever qualify as an outsider, the irony is this. If you were to answer in secret ballot, have you ever been that outsider? My guess, which I cannot possibly prove, my guess is that those who would answer yes would be close to 100%. At some point in time, even amongst our most valued family, I'm sure we have all, or nearly all of us, have felt like being the outsider. And the comfort that comes from this morning's exhortation is that as we read the story of Hagar, we realize that even though Hagar is unseen by many, she is seen by God. God sees the outsider even when others do not. Let's bother to introduce ourselves to why Hagar is such an outsider. And first, we just notice her name. And I suggest to you, this is a suggestion to take away and test for yourself, that when you meet someone by name in Scripture, I think most of the time the name you read has got nothing to do with what their parents called them. I think that in the oral history with which God blessed his people, he gave them names that actually explained their role in a story. It doesn't matter whatever their parents called them. I mean, the most classic case surely is the book of Ruth. Ruth initially opens up by considering the woman Naomi. And Naomi has two sons. And those two sons are called Death and Destruction. And I don't think she called them that. But we know that their role in the story is to die. And so that helps us remember the story, because if we spoke Hebrew fluently, or if we translated into English, their names are Death and Destruction. And they each marry a wife. One is Orpah and one is Ruth. And when both the husbands die, and we have three widows, Naomi, the elder widow, with her two daughters-in-law, both widows, Naomi says to them, I can't really look after you. I can't help you. You're better off fighting for yourself. One of them takes off over the horizon. Her name is Gazelle. The other one says, whatever happens, I will stick by you. Her name is Friendship. Ruth. How immensely convenient. And that's what I say when I say I think most of the people we meet in the Bible have got the names which tell you what in the story their role will be and what role they will fulfill. We therefore will encounter some conflict between two women. One of them is Abraham's wife, at this time called Sarai. Now Sarai is in a position of extreme privilege. She is married to the most powerful man in the entire region. And her name, we're told, is Princess. I believe that. She lived the life of a princess. But today, this morning, to bring ourselves to the emblems, we're going to think about the other person principally. and her name is Hagar, very similar to the Hebrew word Hagar, meaning outsider. So straight away, when you read this conflict, it's a conflict of princess versus outsider. You already know who's going to win. Outsider doesn't stand a chance. The reasons that Hagar is an outsider are quite obvious. She's an immigrant. She's an Egyptian. So she has no citizens' rights in the house of Abraham. She's a slave, which means beyond having no citizens' rights, she has no personal rights, no governance over her own body, no governance over her own daily schedule. And if that couldn't be any less low in society, she's also a concubine, which means she is being used by a man to generate children for himself, which means should she ever be emancipated and set free from her slavery, it is quite likely in that culture that no man would ever want her because she's already borne children for another. She is an immigrant, she is a slave, she is a concubine. Rahab was a foreign prostitute. That's fairly low in society. Ruth, arguably even lower, a widow and an immigrant from a hated nation of Moab. But if you really want to meet the lowest of the lowest of the low, you can't find a lower placed human than Hagar, the immigrant, slave, concubine woman. And so frequently we learn God is the God of the outsider. God is the God of the disadvantaged. And he sees the outsider even when others don't. Sarah and Sarai and Abraham, her owners, certainly don't see Hagar. We'll see that in just a minute. And for Hagar, perhaps uniquely, her disadvantages actually continue to this present day. Now, I'm well aware she's long dead and experiences no consciousness. But some of the early Christian writers misunderstood what Paul said when he wrote about Hagar. Augustine, for example, ended up suggesting that Hagar represents the state of sin. Hagar represents sin, and Sarah represents, by contrast, the state of righteousness. And the reason he suggested this, erroneously, is because of what Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 4. And you can turn there with me if you will. Galatians chapter 4, and I'm going to start at verse 24. These things may be taken figuratively, says Paul, for the women, Hagar and Sarah, represent two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar, Hagar the slave. Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above, spiritual Jerusalem, is free, and she is our mother. And that, of course, is Sarah. So what Paul is saying to the Galatians, and by extension to all those who follow Christ, including us, is you should be the happiest people around. You should be turning cartwheels in the streets. You don't live like poor Hagar as a slave. You've been set free by the work of Christ, and you live now in a position of privilege and freedom, as Sarah always lived. So Paul contrasts slavery with freedom, not sin with righteousness. Yes, we are enslaved to sin, and it's these arguments that are misunderstood in early Christian writings, and therefore within the formation of some of the earlier Christian denominations, and arguably even our own. I could confess that even myself, in careless thinking, used to sort of vaguely think, yes, Hagar's the sin and Sarah's the righteousness, and it's not true. Looking carefully at what Paul wrote, he was speaking with sympathy concerning Hagar, who lived the life of enslavement, to teach us the lessons of the freedom that we enjoy as princesses, if you will, as children of Sarah. We'll see how Abraham and Sarai treat Hagar, and one thing we notice is that they don't want to use her name. If you have Genesis 16 now open in front of you, which Brother Stephen kindly read for us, you'll see that when Sarai wants Hagar dismissed, or even before that, in fact, you'll notice how she refrains from using any name. Verse 2, go, sleep with my slave, my nameless slave. Verse 5, when she's angry, I put my slave in your arms. And Abraham replies the same way, your slave is in your hands. They don't see Hagar. And Hagar is ultimately dismissed because she has rejoiced in her pregnancy, which Sarah was unable to enjoy. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert beside the road to Shur. Stop. Two extraordinary things have just happened in that verse. The words are on the screen in front of you. Did you spot them? Sarai mistreated Hagar. Okay, so she fled from her. Fine, that makes sense. The angel of the Lord found Hagar. Stop. We know that Abraham and Sarah are the central characters of Genesis and will flow forward into the New Testament and the hope that we enjoy as adopted children of Abraham through the work of Jesus Christ. But do you realize, so when Hagar runs away from Sarai, the camera crew should have stayed focused on Sarah. Sarah mistreated Hagar, Hagar ran away. What then did Sarah do? We don't know. Because the actual focus of the biblical narrative doesn't follow Sarah, it follows Hagar. It says Hagar is the star of this show. Even though Abraham and Sarah will become critical to our own salvation, right now, says the Bible, we're not following Sarai, we're following Hagar. She's the leading lady of this story. And even more remarkable, the angel of the Lord found Hagar. The Hebrew word is malak for angel. Here's an idea. Run a little test in your Sunday school groups or even amongst the ecclesias and ask the question, who was the first human ever visited by an angel of the Lord? Using the Hebrew word malak. I don't know what answers you're going to get. My guess, it was the angels that visited Lot in Sodom. That's Genesis chapter 19. And the smarter will realize that before those angels went down to the city in the plain, they had visited Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. That's Genesis chapter 18. But before righteous Lot, before mighty father Abraham, the first visit of an angel to a human is right here in chapter 16. It's the immigrant, concubine, slave woman. Hagar is first. The first visitation of one of the angels of God to a human, he chooses Hagar. That's something I think often goes unnoticed, but should be tremendously important to us. We move on. Sarah mistreated Hagar, and when we look at that word, we notice it's going to crop up again later. It's going to crop up here in Exodus. It was predicted by God in Genesis 15. So the Egyptians put slave masters over the Hebrews to mistreat them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. That's the same word. It might be a coincidence, but what Sarai did to Egyptian Hagar, much later, the countrymen of Hagar, the Egyptians, later did to Sarah's children. It's a match which is perhaps coincidental, perhaps not. What actually underscores the coincidence is the first time that Hagar runs away from, shall we call her Israelite Sarah, she runs to a place called Shur. How interesting, because the first time the Israelites ran away from Egypt, when they fled after Passover, guess where they went? Same place. So there are these little symmetries which allow us to see, and you begin to ask the question, is Sarah's mistreatment of the Egyptian in a way paid back on her children that the Egyptians will later mistreat? But let's follow the main narrative. Hagar has now run to the desert. She's been banished, and God sees her. Here is the first person in the text that will call her by name. It's not her mistress, Sarai. It's not her owner, Abram. It is Almighty God, creator of the heavens and the earth. He sees Hagar and calls her by name. Hagar, says God, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered. Where have you heard those words before? You've heard those words before very recently, just in the preceding chapter. I will give you descendants that cannot be numbered. They shall be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the sea. This is the same promise that God gave to Abraham. And I know in our community that Abraham is so well studied, and rightly so, that just about every Sunday school student knows that God promised Abraham descendants that could not be numbered. Ask yourselves, how many of our Sunday school students know that God made the identical promise to Hagar? Not to Hagar's father, not to Hagar's son, not to Hagar's husband, she doesn't have one, to Hagar herself, the immigrant, slave, concubine woman, the lowest of the lowest of the lowest of the low. And that is whom God has favored as much as he favored the father of the faithful. Hagar is overwhelmed, you can imagine. She called the name of the Lord, you are the God who sees me, in Hebrew, El Roi. I have seen the one who sees me. How poignant it is. She has gone her whole life unseen. Her name has never been heard because she's only ever referred to as that woman or that slave or your slave or my slave. And for the first time ever, someone has seen her and called her by name, and it's God. And she's overjoyed. You are the God who sees me. You are El Roi. She even says, I have seen the God who sees me. And in that, you know, she must have looked upon the angel. Notice that's something that Moses was too afraid to do when he first encountered the angel in the burning bush. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon the angel of God. Moses learns later that he can look upon the angel of God, and eventually it's said of him that Moses meets with the angel of God face to face as a man meets with his friend. Hagar knew right away the connection she was allowed. I have seen the one who sees me. So this is a surprising and unique person. And there's more. There's even more uniqueness. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't get everything right, I believe that Hagar is the only human in the scriptures who ever names God. God names many people, and rightly so. And Hagar is not rebuked for this, so this doesn't seem presumptuous or wrong or sinful. Hagar gives a name to God. You are El Roi, the one who sees me. No other human ever does that. Beyond that, Hagar is called to go back and return to her work as a slave. Go back to your mistress and submit to her, says God. Even the godly do not escape affliction. Godliness does not exempt us from a life of affliction, and she goes back to her slave work. Things don't last long, however, and it's only a few years. Ishmael and Isaac, the two boys, end up competing and fighting, and Hagar is banished to the desert a second time. Sarah still won't see Hagar or Ishmael. She won't use their names. And what we're skipping through history quite quickly, because now we're in Genesis chapter 21, but what's happened in Genesis chapter 20? Do you remember Abraham and Sarah lived in Gerar, basically in Egypt, or at least in the Negev. And Abimelech is there. And Abraham is afraid he'll be killed if he admits that he's Sarah's husband. So he half lies and says, well, she's my relative, she's my sister. And Abimelech takes Sarah into his household, presumably to make her a wife. But God sees that Abimelech is a godly man, and he prevents anything from happening, and then comes to Abimelech in a dream and says, you better give that man his wife back, or else your life is forfeit. The interesting thing is, what about Sarah's experience? Sarah is taken away from her husband and put into an Egyptian household where she is now not necessarily a slave, but she is the powerless one. So now you have an Egyptian household with Abimelech in charge. Abraham's no longer able to influence or help, and she is alone in the household as the powerless one. A powerless Israelite, if you will, in a household of powerful Egyptians. She gets to live Hagar's life for however long she was trapped there before God set her free. And we might think, well, that's nice. Now that she's experienced what it's like to be in Hagar's powerless position, hopefully she'll have a little bit more empathy towards Hagar after she's released from that scene. But such are the consequences of the human soul, that's not true. As soon as she comes back to her princess level of power in Abraham's household and Hagar is the powerless one, I'm afraid, sadly, nothing has changed. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son, who also doesn't have a name, it seems, will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. My son has a name. That slave woman does not have a name. That woman's son does not have a name either. I don't see them. And we saw some rather interesting parallels between the way Sarah mistreated Hagar and the way the Egyptians later mistreated Sarah's children, the Israelites. We have one more parallel here. The verb get rid of is exactly the same verb that Pharaoh, the Egyptian leader, of course, uses when he finally banishes the Israelites to the desert. So just as Sarah banishes Egyptian Hagar to the desert with the word, I've forgotten the Hebrew word, get rid of or get out, so Pharaoh, the Egyptian powerful one, will dismiss Israel into the desert with that same word. Once again, what Sarah did to Egyptian Hagar, Egypt later did to Sarah's children. And perhaps it's also important for us to recognize, because we don't want to turn this into a history lesson, luckily, Sarah is wrong. Because Sarah has said, I'm not going to have any Gentiles sharing in the hope of Israel. That woman's son, that Gentile woman's son, will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Luckily, that's wrong. God sees us Gentiles, us outsiders, and he makes a path. He makes room, Yahanan. It's actually the basis of my own Christian name, Yahanan. God makes room for the outsider and allows us to share in the hope of Israel. And Hagar is dismissed a second time. And here it becomes very poignant, particularly given that our whole theme, the whole motif of Hagar's life is, am I seen? Am I unseen? Who sees me? Who doesn't? Hagar went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes, sat down about a bowshot away, and she prayed as she began to cry, don't let me see the boy die. I don't want to see anymore. How critically poignant from a woman who has celebrated being seen. Please make me blind. I don't want to see anymore, because the sight of what I'm about to watch is simply too dreadful. I cannot watch my child die. The one who celebrated El Roy, the God who sees me, I have seen. She begs that same seeing God, please take away my sight. And God answers very carefully and very cleverly. He again reassures her that he sees her because he calls her again by name, and he says, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy, whose name is God hears, the irony, crying as he lies there. God has heard. And what God is saying to Hagar, and by extension to us, is, I don't work just one way. Yes, I have seen you, and you have seen me, but I have other faculties. I have other means by which to connect with you. Even if you can't see, you can hear me. I can hear you. God has heard, playing on a different sensation of human perception. And that's the same for us. There are places where we commonly meet God. Perhaps a Sunday morning when we're enclosed in a room with all of us who are like-minded and have like precious faith and like precious desires is one of the easier ways to connect with God. But even should there come times when this mechanism does not work for you, for whatever reason, and regardless of whose fault it is, remember, God connects in many ways and in many times. The one who relies on seeing should not forget to listen and hear. God connects with us in so many different ways and gives us reassurance. God shows Hagar that he hears as well as he sees. And the story ends, as we will end now, with a return to the visual motif. God opened her eyes. She'd prayed for blindness, and it's like God had granted her prayer for blindness very briefly, but opened her eyes, and Hagar saw a well of water. And in seeing the well of water, of course, she sees the means by which God has saved her, and by which the one who's seen her can be seen once again. Those who feel unseen are seen and heard and will share in the inheritance. And I think we learn that no more plainly and no more poignantly than in the wonderful story of God's love for Hagar.